Okay, today we will be reading one of the major female writers of the 20th century, Hayashi Fumiko's short story Bangiku, Late Chrysanthemum, published in 1948. Okay, so right after the war, 3 years after the war, after the end of the war, she published this work. Let me briefly introduce Hayashi Fumiko, and then we'll jump right into the questions. There are many questions on this work, despite it being a very short story, maybe 10 pages or so, I think, in the translation, which was done by Lane Dunlap in 1986. So we'll be reading the translation and the original. I have the link to the original there. Okay, novelist Hayashi Fumiko, whose realistic stories deal with urban working class life. Okay, that's a central theme in her works. Rarely are her protagonists wealthy upper class people. They're usually people on the bottom or middle rungs of society. Hayashi lived an unsettled life until 1916, when she went to Onomichi, where she stayed until graduation from high school until 1922. In her lonely childhood, she grew to love literature, and when she went out to work, she started writing poetry and children's stories in her spare time. Hayashi's own experience of hunger and humiliation. Okay, so she lived a life marked by severe poverty, and then the war, of course, which she lived through. These experiences of hunger and humiliation appeared in her first work, Horoki, right? Diary of a Vagabond. Okay, and there's a translation of that in the English book, Be a Woman, Hayashi Fumiko in Modern Japanese Women's Literature. And also Seihin no Sho, A Life of Poverty, Seihin no Sho, I should say. Her stories of degradation and instability, depicting women who remained undaunted, commanded a strong following, often near sentimentality. They are saved by a realistic and direct style. She reached the peak of her popularity after World War II, when stories such as Downtown, published in English translation in Modern Japanese Stories and Anthologies, and Ukigumo. There's a translation of Ukigumo, or Floating Clouds, as well, but I can't remember who did it. Possibly Lane Dunlap as well. I'll have to look into that. Mirrored the harsh post-war scene. Hayashi died suddenly of heart strained from overwork. Okay, so that's the brief introduction to her life and works provided by one of the encyclopedias, I think. And I have the link there to her main texts in Japanese, which are online for free reading at Aozora Bunko. If you're not familiar with Aozora Bunko, you should familiarize yourself with it. It's one of the major websites that makes available all kinds of literary works, of Japanese literary works, from mostly modern, but there's some pre-modern and early modern stuff as well there. So check out that website, and a lot of her works are there. You can read them for free in Japanese there. Practice your reading. Okay, right into the study questions now. Number 1. What type of narrator is used in this story? Where is the focalization point? Does the focalization point move from character to character? If so, explain. Okay, the fact that I have the focalization point question in there should tell you already that this is not a first-person narrator, that it's a third-person narrator. However, the third-person narrator is very close in focalization to the main central female protagonist. Okay, so answer that question. Number 2, describe the style of narration. Is there more showing or representation, or is there more telling or presentation? Okay, so these are two key literary words that I always mention: showing and telling. In other words, representation or presentation. Okay, so you should always be very aware of which method is being deployed more, showing or telling. Okay, answer that question in the context of this story. Number 3, describe the willful, proud, beautiful but aging, retired geisha Aizawa Kin. Okay, that's her name, Aizawa Kin. Describe her appearance, her personality, her sexual history, her work history, her background, her upbringing, her drug use. Okay, so once again we see drugs appear in this work. You see that a lot in works of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, really. Financial circumstances, worldview, sense of values, line of work. Obviously, she was a geisha, former prostitute. But keep in mind that there are different levels of prostitution in Japan in the 1930s and 40s. Which level is she? Did she start up in the higher ranks of geisha world and sort of fall? Where does she stand in this world of the demi-monde, right? How has she changed over the years, if at all? Okay, so there are constant reflections or reminiscences of her past life. How is this past self contrasted with herself at present, right? Is she a symbol for something? Okay, she might not be, but consider whether she's an archetype or a symbol, a symbolic character of some sort. Number 4. Here comes an airplane. We pause for the airplane. Okay, number 4, describe Kin's much younger lover, Tabe. Okay, describe his background, his past and present circumstances, his war experience. What is his motivation for visiting Kin? Okay, so he's met her before, they've been lovers before, and then he went through the war experience, and presumably the war experience changed him in some kind of fundamental way. How did it change him, right? Okay, what is his motivation for visiting Kin, right? Despite all the years, despite her age and so forth. How has he changed? Number 5, note the literary and cultural references that appear in the work. Okay, Heisei Monogatari, for example, Ihara Saikaku. Heisei Monogatari, we'll be reading that work, the Tales of Ise, right? Written in the early Heian period, so the beginning of the 9th century, is a major work of classical Japanese literature. And it's referred to in this work. In what capacity? What is the function of those allusions? Explain. As well as Ihara Saikaku, who's the great gesaku, or ukiyo zoshi, novelist of the early modern period, of the Edo period. Okay, so she refers to these worlds. Well, why is she referring to these texts specifically, right? And when you answer this, keep in mind the idea of koushoku, or iro gonomi, right? So there's this long tradition of sort of erotic literature in Japan. Heisei Monogatari is sort of the beginning of that, and it continues through Ihara Saikaku. And the narrator of this work, the third-person narrator, as well as the central female protagonist of the story, see themselves kind of in this line of iro gonomi literature. So keep that in mind as you answer this question. What is the function and effect of these literary and cultural allusions? And there are others too. Make a list of the other ones that appear here. Okay, number 6. When and where does the story take place? Discuss the importance of the historical context. Okay, so where are we exactly? I said this story was published in 1948, 3 years after the war. But where are we exactly? Okay, does it jump around at all? Or is it sort of a chronologically implotted story? That was number 6. Number 7. Describe Kin's frame of mind in the opening scene. How does she prepare for Tabe's visit? Okay, what does she expect from the encounter? So the story begins with her preparing for his visit, with her nervousness and anxiety and all kinds of things about her character are revealed in this preparation scene. Okay, what does she expect? Her expectations. Are her expectations fulfilled in the end, or are they let down in some way? That's number 7. Number 8, describe the reunion between Kin and Tabe. Okay, a straightforward question about their reunion. How does the encounter fail to meet her expectations? What fortress, she uses the word toride in Japanese, what fortress stands between them? Okay, what is this? She uses metaphor of the fortress. What does this metaphor of the fortress stand for? Number 9, describe the circumstances of Kin and Tabe's relationship 4 years ago. Okay, how are things different then? Okay, so we don't get a direct depiction of them 4 years ago, but there are all kinds of reminiscences and flashbacks and memories that appear in the narrative. How are things different then? Number 10, discuss the undercurrent of violence in the story. Okay, so the war is in the background. They've just lived through the war. Period of 7 years, right, of unprecedented violence, 15 years if you look at the war from the Chinese perspective, 1931 to 45, according to the Chinese. And this undercurrent of violence is present here, okay? So in what ways is violence present in the work? Explain, okay? is there a foreshadowing of the potential violence on page 102. Okay, so the story ends before we see exactly what happens, right? But there might be some violence involved. Number 11. Where are we? Hold on. Number 11. Discuss the role of the deaf maid Kinu. Okay, so Kinu is the only other character in the work. There are 3, including her. She's the deaf maid. Okay, so the geisha king obviously is not at the bottom of the demimonde geisha world, right? If she has a maid who's serving her, right, or takes care of her. Discuss the role of this deaf maid Kinu. How does she serve as a contrast to Kin, that should say, right? So there's Kinu and Kin, and they're kind of foils. Kinu is kind of a foil for Kin. She brings out or emphasizes certain characteristics of Kin. What qualities of Tabe does her presence bring out? Okay, so through King, the maid, we see certain things. We learn certain things about Tabe as well. What do we learn about him through this character, third character? Number 12. How do memories of Kin's past lovers, for example Itaya, Yamazaki, appear in the story? Okay, so even as she's with Tabe, she's having these memories and reminiscences of all kinds of previous lovers that are all floating into her mind at the moment, right? How do these memories contrast with the reality of Tabe? Okay, so there's this kind of idealized, romanticized past affairs that she's had in her glory days, and it's contrasted with the present. Number 13. Discuss the following passage in terms of the social context of the post-war period. Okay, and the passage is this. You're saying I didn't turn out well then, Tabe says. Yes, I am, she says. That's thanks to you and the long war. Ah, that's an excuse, she says. Things like that are not the person. You've become completely vulgar. So what if I'm vulgar? That's how people are. Okay? So he's been kind of vulgarized by the war, and she's saying it's not because of the war exclusively, that he's got this sort of inner nature that is vulgar, and the war just brought it out. Alright, explain the significance of that passage. 2 more questions. Number 14. Discuss the significance of Kin's final act, which is the burning of her picture of young Tabe. Okay, so at the end of the story, she burns the picture of Tabe. What does this act mean? What does it signify? Why is she doing this? Will she ever see Tabe again in the future? Or is this the end of it? Number 15. This work has been described by the prominent post-war critic. He was actually active in the 1930s as well, before the war and during the war. Nakamura Mitsuo. Okay, described this work as one of the 10 best naturalist Shizen Shugi pieces of modern Japanese literature. Okay, what naturalist Shizen Shugi qualities do you see in the text? And Shizen Shugi, of course, is one of the very important words that you see in literary histories about the modern Japanese literature. Shizen Shugi, I think I've explained it in other videos. If you want to review that, review the worksheets. I have several definitions of it. To put it very briefly, Shizen Shugi, or naturalism, right, emerges in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, right? Zola, these kind of writers, Maupassant, these writers who are reacting to the excesses of Romanticism, right? So Romanticism preceded naturalism. So it's reacting to that. It's incorporating all kinds of scientific discourses, sociology. It's sort of making a science out of art, out of novel writing, out of fiction. Okay, that's what naturalism is in the beginning, and that comes into Japan in the 1890s, right? And morphs into something a little bit different, right? So Shizen Shugi in Japan is usually divided into 2 stages, right? Shizen Shugi, Zenki Shizen Shugi, or first phase Shizen Shugi, and Koki Shizen Shugi, second phase Shizen Shugi, which is the I novel. Okay, so the first phase is the Zola-influenced scientific sort of sociological novels, right, in the 1890s, early 1900s. And then you have the emergence of the I novel around 1907, the Watakushi Shousetsu. So it kind of takes the ideas of Shizen Shugi and privatizes them and sort of reduces them to the level of the individual. So the Shizen Shugi, or the second phase of Shizen Shugi, or the I novel in Japan, becomes a very private affair, right? And I have a feeling Nakamura Mitsuo is using the word here in both senses. In Shizen Shugi Zenki, Shizen Shugi phase and sense, and the later Shizen Shugi sense. Okay. At any rate, how do you think this work is naturalistic, if at all? You can argue against it and say that no, he got it wrong. It's not. It's very different than the typical Shizen Shugi works that appear in the 20th century. Okay. That last question probably will require you to think longest and hardest and look into several of into literary history in Japan a little bit more. So answer that last question to the best of your ability. If you have any questions about any of these, send me an email. That is all for now. Okay. Bye-bye.